Now, growing vegetables can take up quite a bit of space, and if you've got a garden or a vegetable plot where you have limited space, or maybe you've got plenty of space but you just need more, it might be worthwhile looking around your vegetable plot and asking yourself the question, are there places that I can grow vegetables that I might not really have thought of before? And in this video I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. I've downsized this year into a much smaller growing space, so I need to try and maximise as much space as I possibly can. And what I'm going to do today in this video is show you how I'm going to start to grow vegetables where there was a former hedge. I'm also going to show you the step-by-step process of how I go about transforming this former hedge into a productive vegetable growing space. And hopefully this might give you one or two ideas about how you can maximise your growing area. Now, I think as vegetable growers, we're often surprised by the amount of space our vegetables take up. And even though we may plan a certain area, when we start to plant our plants out, and particularly when they start to grow and develop, they can take a larger area than we expected. So if we can find ways of making more space, then clearly we can grow more vegetables. Now, I'm going to use the site of a hedge that I've cut back, but this will equally work if you've got overgrown areas in your garden or allotment, or maybe areas that are redundant and you thought that you couldn't use them before. Now, it'd be quite easy to think that growing vegetables where there was a hedge previously is going to be quite challenging, but actually it's going to be straightforward, and particularly because I'm going to be using a no-dig method in this particular area. And because I have a pathway at the back of the hedge, I've decided to keep some of the hedge just to keep a bit of privacy and just use the area in front. Therefore, there's already established roots from the hedge in this ground. So if I wanted to use a traditional method by digging it all up, it would take an awful lot of work. Now, I am going to have to do a little bit of work to this ground to get it ready, even for a no-dig bed. However, I don't need to use my garden fork to try and dig every single root out of this ground. And by the end of this video, in a very short period of time, I plan to have my onions planted and growing in the new bed. Now, the first thing you have to do is identify where you could potentially make your growing space. I've identified this area here. Now, originally this hedge here was all the way to where the fork is here. So by doing this, I'm adding an area almost as wide as this, which should give me a nice space for a nice little raised bed. Now, as I've said, I've decided to keep a little bit of the hedge behind for privacy. We're in very early spring at the moment, so this will be full of leaves within the next month or so. And that'll provide a nice bit of privacy from the path behind. And yes, it will provide a little bit of shade in relation to the vegetables that are growing. For the type of vegetables I'm going to grow, that's not going to be a major problem. Now, this is a really sturdy and well-established hedge. I've been in this house for over 10 years, and this hedge has been here as long as I have. And therefore, there's some fairly thick branches that you'll find throughout the hedge. Now, the larger branches, I've used a handsaw to cut them off, and for the smaller branches I've used a set of garden crops which quite easily allow me to cut the hedge back as much as I want. Now, even though I want to grow more vegetables, what I don't want to do is diminish from the overall garden we currently have, because I have two young grandchildren and they love playing in the garden, so all of the grass is off limits for vegetable growing. But this area was completely redundant as a hedge, so it makes sense that I use this area to grow. So the first thing you need to do is identify where you want to locate your new growing bed and prepare your new growing area by either cutting the hedge back if you've got a hedge there, or clearing it if you've got brambles or anything else that you might find in that particular area. So now that the new growing area is now the size that I want it, and I've cut the hedge down to ground level, we now need to look at the ground and do a bit of preparation before we start putting the growing bed in position. Now, clearly, dealing with ground where there was a former hedge can be quite problematic, because there can be some really well-established root systems in here. One of the ideas of no-dig gardening is you disturb the ground as little as possible. Now, I've decided to use a very small raised bed in this area. I'm going to use something called a pallet collar, which I'll show you in a moment what that is. And the reason I've decided to do that is because the pallet collar will allow the sides to support a higher level of compost. And the type of vegetables I'm planning to grow here are going to be shallow root vegetables such as onions, lettuces, radishes, spring onions, etc. So now you'll see in a moment that I am going to put cardboard on top of this before I start to put the compost on top. But because I have things like ivy and other types of roots in here, I am going to go around and look at the bed and just maybe pull up some of the more larger type of established roots before I put the cardboard down. Now, clearly the idea of the cardboard is to deny the weeds any light, and that will help to kill them off. But in a hedgerow, there could be a combination of different types of plants and other types of growth that might need to be dealt with. So for example, in this one, I've got ivy, which is pretty much everywhere around this hedge. So what my plan is, I'm going to pull up the ivy as much as I possibly can. And where there's any larger established roots, I may look at trying to chop them out or dig them out before I start. Now, when this vegetable bed is in place and completed, it will be a no-dig bed. And if I was preparing this no-dig bed on, say, for example, grass or another area which had a small amount of weeds on it, I wouldn't need to do any digging. I could literally just put the cardboard on top. But this is a former hedgerow and there's a lot of growth in here and it needs to be dealt with before we put the cardboard down. And if you look at the advice on Charles Dowding's website, it does recommend that if you are putting a no-dig bed where you've had former brambles, that you should deal with those first before you start to put your cardboard down. Well, after about 5 minutes of pulling out those ivy and the other weeds, I realised I needed to go a little bit deeper. Because it's a former hedgerow, there are some pretty established roots in there. And as you can see from that small area, I've pulled out quite a lot of weeds and roots. And I really think it's worth doing. Remember, this will be a no-dig bed for many, many years. So therefore, if it is necessary just to put a tiny bit of effort in at the very beginning to get most of the roots out, particularly in a hedgerow, then it's well worth doing. Now, in preparing this ground, I haven't gone too deep with the fork. I've literally put the fork in the ground and prized the roots and the weeds up. So even though, as you can see, it's slightly disturbed, I haven't gone and done a full dig and turn as you would with traditional digging. So now I've got the ground reasonably how I want it. I'm going to get rid of all these weeds and then we're going to start to put the raised bed in position. Now, as I mentioned, for this area, I'm going to use a very small raised bed. You don't have to use a raised bed if you don't want to. You can just use a traditional method of using no dig by, after you've prepared the ground, put the cardboard down and then put your compost on top. But conscious that this was a former hedgerow, I am going to use a very small raised bed and I'm going to use something called a pallet colour. A lot of you will be familiar with these. This is one that I brought along from my former allotment and it's pretty much a ready-made raised bed. You can make your own by getting timber and screwing them together, but these are pretty practical. And because it was already in my allotment, I just brought it home to use here. So the first thing I'm going to do is roughly mark out the position of where I want the raised bed. Now that looks about right to me, and the reason I'm doing that is because I just want to get an idea of how far the cardboard needs to go. So now I'm going to take this off and start to put the cardboard in position. One of the key stages in the no-dig method is to use cardboard. That's what we're going to do next. Now the cardboard acts as almost like a protection layer that will significantly reduce the possibility of weed growth because it will deny them of light. Now the type of cardboard you want to use is this clear brown cardboard here. What you don't want to use is shiny cardboard or anything with ink in it because remember it's in the ground. So this will decompose fairly quickly once you start to water it and you start to put the compost on top. What you don't want is any chemicals or anything that's in the cardboard leaching out, which could potentially ruin your vegetables. And if you've got any cardboard that's got tape on it, take the tape off as well because sometimes the glue can contain chemicals. So make sure you remove all the tape and make sure the cardboard is completely clear before you use it. Then what we're going to do is put the cardboard roughly in position. I am going to overlap it slightly so it's slightly bigger than the raised bed. Where it does meet with other cardboard, make sure it's got a decent overlap on it. And now we have a nice thick layer of cardboard ready. I have noticed while I was doing that, I had some cardboard that was printed, so I'm not going to use that for these beds. So now that that's ready, we now need to put our raised bed on top. As you can see, the raised bed is now in position, and all I'm going to do now is just put another layer of cardboard just on the edge to extend the edge slightly, because I do want to put a bit of wood chip on the edge to separate it from the next raised bed. Next job is to fill up the raised bed. Now, those of you who use raised beds will know if you have a lot of them, it can take quite a lot of material to fill them up, particularly if you've got deep ones. This one's actually pretty shallow, I'm guessing around about 6 inches, so actually filling it up isn't going to be a major problem. But I watched a fantastic video this morning from Tony O'Neill at Simplified Gardening, showing you a really good technique for how to fill up quite deep raised beds, and it'll cost you virtually nothing. These are less of a problem unless you have lots of them. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is put a layer of old leaves, which were lying around the garden, in the bottom. These leaves have already started to decompose, and they'll continue to do so when you start to put the compost on top. And if you have more leaves available, you can put some more in. Next thing I'm going to use to fill the bed up is my own homemade compost. So I'm just going to go and get some and come back and then put it on top of these leaves. Now, one of the best things you can do as a vegetable grower is to make your own compost. This compost here I made last year over at my allotment and brought it over. I've had 2 bulk bags full of my own compost, which I'm now going to use to nearly fill up this raised bed. This compost really is good stuff. So I'm just spreading it out reasonably evenly before we put our final layer on there. There's plenty of videos on my channel showing you how to make compost and leaf mould and all other things for free. I'll attach links to those videos below so you can make some for yourself. If you have got limited space, Hugh Richards did a video recently showing you how to make compost in pathways. Absolutely fascinating. Literally is putting your discarded grass and leaves, your greens and your browns into your pathways and still using them as pathways and just letting them decompose. So even if you have limited space, there's still ways you can make your own compost, because as we know, it can get very, very expensive. So that's that reasonably level. I'm not trying to fill it right to the top. I'd imagine we've now got about 4 inches worth of fill. And now all I'm going to do is add a bag of multi-purpose compost that I bought from the garden centre. This is the clover compost that I've referred to in a number of previous videos. And in my opinion, the best multi-purpose compost there is, that represents best value for money. The only issue with this compost, it does contain peat, and as we know from 2024, peat-based composts are going to be banned. All I'm going to do now, spread this lovely compost just on top of my bed, nice and even, and I am just going to tamp it down with my hand just to give it a bit of compaction so that when we do put the veg in, it just gives the roots something to grow into. And now we have one raised bed ready to plant in a position 30 minutes ago there was a former hedge. What I'm going to do now before I plant, I'm just going to get a bit of wood chip, just put it round the sides just to make it tidy, because I am going to extend this area further over for more growing space, and I just want it to be nice and tidy. And now that I have a brand new growing bed, all I need to do now is plant my vegetables. What's really great about this is that I'll be planting vegetables now in an area with pretty much a redundant hedge. Now in this bed I'm going to plant onions. This is a variety called Exhibition which I grew last year, which produced really nice large onions. I planted these seeds in mid-January and have grown them inside because I haven't got a heated greenhouse, but now they're large enough to plant outside. Now the compost in here is going to be reasonably soft because we've just put it in, and even though I've hand compacted it, I am still going to use a dibber, which effectively is like a tool handle with a point on it. You can use your fingers if you want, it doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to put a little hole with my dibber, pop in my onion, and then just put a bit of compost around it. And now I'm going to plant the rest of the bed, planting these round about 3 to 4 inches apart, and that should take up half of this bed. If, by the way, you are transplanting onions, they do look a little bit wispy when you first transplant them. Don't worry about that, that's perfectly normal, and these will catch up. All I'll do now is give that a bit of a water, and that'll be done. So you saw how reasonably easy that was to create extra space where you might not think you have any. And I hope maybe that's given you 1 or 2 ideas for yourself. I am going to create a few more raised beds next to this one in this particular area of my garden, and the other part of my garden I'll only use the traditional method this year and just do a comparison to see if there is any major difference. I probably will, over the course of time, end up going to all raised beds, even on the other part of my garden. But you know what? I'll see what happens first. So I'm really happy with this, and I really hope it's given you a bit of inspiration to maybe look at creative ways of expanding your growing space if you've got limited space. And I do hope you liked the video, and if you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you want to subscribe to the channel for future videos on how to sow and grow fruit and veg and flowers, and 1 or 2 recipe ideas, don't forget to press the subscribe button. And I'll see you all on the next video.